Before asking the panelists to join me, I will do a brief introduction about the subject of this morning. So, first of all, a word of welcome to our first panel about benefits and challenges of open source integration. So every company is becoming a technology company, and every person is also now becoming a technology company too. And this is not me who invented this quote, it's from Peter Sondergaard, the Gartner chief analyst. And I like particularly this because we can experience this social trend at the moment while innovation is becoming omnipresent in our company organizations or in our life. So you probably noticed also that each product now priced over 100 € is a smart product, is able to collect data, to share data, and also sometimes to display data. So innovation goes software, collaborative, and also open source. That's the case, of course, in the cloud computing we talked about this morning. That's true also in mobile applications and for the Internet of Things also, of course, which is a work that's starting at the moment. We see this in the middleware where you are involved and sometimes with us at OW2. Collaborative open source provide new services faster than ever, but we are also facing new challenges in this co-innovation space between developers, integrators, open source communities, editors, and end users. So this morning panel is about innovation. It's also about software engineering and about open source software integration. We will check with the panelists the benefits, the challenges, and also some ways to solve these challenges together in order to get more advantages. So it's now my privilege to welcome the panelists. I'm very glad to welcome international experts, starting with Dr. Claudia Ayala. Good morning, Claudia. Welcome also Yassine Kedash from Alizeo. Yassine is CEO of Alizeo, a French system integrator. Good morning. Good morning, hello, Serge Lacourte. You are the CEO of Scale Agent Distributed Technologies, the editor of Joram. And last but not least, Guillaume Rousseau. Good morning. Guillaume holds a PhD in astrophysics from Paris 7 University, but he's now also the CEO of Antelic, a software and service company which reduces open source cost and risk. So this is typically the subject of this morning panel. So Claudia, let's start with you. As you are involved in software engineering and innovation, what is the place that you see for open source software in this project?
Okay, first of all, I would like to highlight that my perspective comes from the research perspective, from my background as a software engineering, working since 5 years ago in the software engineering and focusing in the open source area. And also from my participation in some industrial projects, research projects with industrial participation. So from this perspective, I would like to say that, of course, we see a very increasing adoption regarding open source. From the research perspective, we see that open source is changing the way in which the organizations acquire, develop, and also commercialize software. And the ways in which these organizations adopt open source are very diverse. Of course, integration is one of the most important ones because this has to be with the way that the organizations develop and commercialize the software. And does it need something?
No.
I'm sorry.
Don't be afraid. It's okay.
Okay, I was thinking that I need to stop. Okay, and coming back to that point, I would also like to refer to one report from Gartner that says that one prediction they have is that in 2016, they predict that 95% of the applications that around the world, all IT organizations will leverage open source fundamental components. And if we compare this amount of adoption, I mean, it means a 75% of increasing compared with the prediction that they have for 2010. So I confirm that perspective.
And we can share maybe some European figures also?
Yeah, actually, here I would like to mention that given the importance of integration, especially in this way of adoption or this increasing adoption, we perform a study that involves 25 organizations from Spain, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, and we have some figures that we will share with you during this panel.
Thank you, Claudia. Maybe it would be interesting to step a little bit about the reason, the explanation about this growth of adoption everywhere, as we can see. Is it exclusively for economical reason, or what do you see? What are the motivations? Maybe Yassine.
Morning, everybody. I mean, as an integrator, we are really focused on cloud and working mainly on infrastructure. So most of our customer base is telco, ISPs, and hosters, and people which used to EV users of open source. So for us, we see that open source adoption is growing. Due to the economics, that's true that we have, I mean, let's say big companies which are more taking care about the economics and the money they're going to spend and try to reduce the software costs. That's true. But, and also competition is pretty hard. So sometimes, and especially on cloud, if you are not using open source today, you may certainly going to die in a few months. So, but that's from our point of view as an integrator and based on our customer base, there's no big change on that because open source has always been part of all the customers we are taking care about.
Guillaume, maybe, do you see motivations or other motivations?
Yeah, at least on our side, most of the time, the decision for open source integration or open source component integration in a software starts with the development team who is doing the integration. So of course, the main reason is then saving time. I'm not even sure that the reason is the money in terms of, okay, do we have an alternative for which we should pay and we don't have the budget? No, most of the time it works. It's available on the web. You can find it, you can test it, you can integrate it very easily. Just think about how easy it is to do integration of a component that is available on the Maven Central, for instance. Just copy paste one line and okay, you have the component and you have the features. So, and then we have some other consideration. Once the component has been integrated, maybe in the very early stage of the development, regarding how you will manage these components through the whole software life cycle, including SLA support, for instance, because if you are providing some support to your customer, you may have to give them some guarantee about the fact you will be able to patch this component, which is indeed an open source component. So, well, basically in this situation, we also have, I would say, two options. Sometimes people subscribe an SLA asking for some provider of services to give them these services. But sometimes they go back to a commercial version of the component. I'm just thinking about some advanced library, for instance, for high performance simulation, for instance, using MPI compiler, for instance, provided by Intel. And usually for this example, most of the time we see the software editors and the integrator of this component switching back to the commercial version of the library, even if in the very early stage of the software development they were using for prototyping the open source version of the component.
Serge wanted to add a word about probably other benefits like flexibility, reliability of the components that we integrate in the projects. Because time to market, when you market new services, you also need to have very stable components.
I'm not sure that an open source component provides more functions than a proprietary component.
Proven functions, maybe?
I believe that with open source you can reach the same level of functionality and of durability of the product. Okay. You may provide more access to the roadmap if you are a big user of the product, or if you organize with other users of the same category, you may have a stronger action on the roadmap of the product. Mm-hmm. So this may be an advantage of the open source. With the open source, you have another advantage is normally the open source version is more widely used than the proprietary version. So this version is tested more thoroughly over a wide range of platforms and so on. So this is another advantage of open source.
Claudia, it's now time to talk about RISCOSS. What kind of risk is the project trying to mitigate?
Okay, so I am participating in a European project that is called RISCOSS, that is trying to deal with some challenges that we have detected in the industrial area in order to foster, let's say, or to allow them to adopt open source components in a more informed way. Because one of the problems that we detected was that small and medium-sized companies have the problem that most of them, based on the study we did, that I mentioned before, integrate open source components. But some of them do this integration in an opportunistic way. So what do I mean by opportunistic? So I mean that they don't really plan to integrate, I mean, an open source. They have some needs to cover some functionalities. If they find some components that can cover this functionality, so it doesn't matter if they are open source. Of course, if they are open source and are good, so they will take it. But the point is that if they have, for instance, a commercial alternative, sometimes depending on the role, the critical role that this component plays on the system, they do a kind of evaluation, I mean, a more intensive evaluation or a more lightweight. Of course, companies usually are under time to market pressure, so they need to go faster. So they have the problem that they want to use open source, and they have some open source alternatives, but they need to evaluate them in a very, very lightweight way. And so they use to see, for instance, if there are companies working in the component. So you mentioned some characteristics as flexibility, reliability, and so on about the components. Actually, they are important, but they, in order to make the evaluation easier, they take into account other factors. For instance, if other companies are participating in the open source community, I mean, if they are important companies, so they feel a kind of reliability in the community, so they usually adopt the component if the functionality is covered. Or another point that it was important is that they wanted to know if other companies, especially if they are big ones and important ones, are using the open source component, because if they are using, so they say, okay, we will use it because if they are using it, so it must be good. But to arrive to that point, I mean, to foster the adoption of open source components, because some of them don't have companies behind because they are just starting or whatever, by means of RISCOSS, we are trying to create a platform that help companies to assess the kind of risk that they will deal from the technical point of view and also from the business point of view, that I think this was the part that was missing, or mainly missing, to evaluate these risks and to help them to assess the risk they have if they adopt open source components or not.
Thank you. Yes, it's interesting to see with you as a system integrator, why do you bet, in fact, on open source components?
I think, first of all, I think it's going to be very hard to have a generic answer on that. Because for me, it's completely linked and tightly linked with the application and the company itself. And if the company has enough human power and enough techies in order to maintain the technologies and the software they would like to rely on. So, and then based on the company and the software, you can see different type of approach. And there's a big differences, for example, if you take Linux, in the US, there's a lot of company which would like, and a lot of company which are heavily using open source, but would like to pay for commercial Linux like Red Hat or SUSE. And in Europe, usually most of our customers are Ubuntu lovers or Debian lovers or CentOS lovers, but most of them don't want or don't think that it's necessary to pay for that. But on the other end, that's also mean they gain in flexibility, in agility, because they can do more or less what they want if they have the power to on the application, the open source components they're going to use. But it's also, it's a very, very different way of managing the integration and the way they're going to use it. And I think that for me, that's very, very important before we can deploy something to a customer or give advice to a customer to understand how we're going to manage, and if it's completely, if the politics we have within the company is in line with their objectives. That's that's usually the main difficulty from my point of view.
And Serge, what about your customers? Do they face specific problems in open source integration? Or do you share with them some challenges?
One challenge for, in my opinion, is related to the question I asked to Orange this morning. That is the sustainability of the open source project itself. I believe the end user should ask himself this question: is the project, the software I use, is it sustainable? Will I have some support on it over the time? Okay. And when I deal with the end user itself, usually it's fine because it is a real question. The difficulty comes when there is an intermediate between the end user and the project. That is the IT company which integrates all the components to build the solution to the end user. And I believe the end user should ask his integrator how does the integrator ensure the sustainability of the products he uses.
Guillaume, if we see the mobile application area, it's a space where the life cycle of the project is very short, and probably Android is leading the market now, which is based on a lot of open source components. Is that the reason why you imagine Google is coming in front of the market?
Wow. Are you sure this is a question for this panel? Well, there is one thing which is quite clear, at least for us on this market, and who's really driving the market toward open source and toward the integration of external component. Of course, as you said, a company is not able to develop from scratch an application on any kind of devices. So now if you think about Google, you think about Microsoft, they are moving toward companies that now are providing some services and some devices. And the main challenges regarding integration of open source component and using open source component to develop those applications running on those devices or providing those services is that you really have to manage two things. The first one is your ability in case of liquidation, in case of litigation, sorry, to have some contradictory evidence about who did what. I mean, who, as you said, provide you this component in this version, in this part of your system. And now usually we talk about, or we speak about, secondary dependency, which is usually the case when you use an open source component, and this component is also using other open source component. But now, if you look at some real situation, you may have 5, 6, up to 10 different level and layer of people providing other component to another entity who is also providing another component to another one, and then you will find it on a device. So definitely what is very efficient regarding business model like Google and of course like Android is that you have a very open system where you can a lot of reusable components. And it's not only because it's open source, because of course you have an alternative, a well-known commercial alternative, but mainly because everyone will be able to use this component, and we use this platform will be able to provide new applications. So regarding the Google example, it's more like a very different business model, more than, okay, it's open source so I can use it.
If we try to find the key success factor in open source integration, what would they be? Do you have some inputs? We say it's always a balance between performance, security, as you say.
As long as it works. I mean, if you can provide a service or product and it works, and it's using open source, and you can provide SLA, I would say, in the set of art to your customer, I mean, it works. And if you save money, that's perfect.
So regarding developers, Serge, what do they have to double check, in fact, when planning an open source integration? I mean, is it more in the source code, the language, the APIs? What kind of specific part of the open source components do they check usually?
You mean the end user?
The end user, yes.
I'm not really an end user, so I have some difficulties to answer that question.
Or Claudia, maybe did you check for?
Well, I will say that based on the study we did, I mean, when we study the practices that the developers have when they come to integrate open source components, they used to talk not too much about the technical part, because they know that they can deal with the technical part. Of course, it could be a problem. They need to evaluate that, but they talk more about the community. I mean, if they analyze if the community is alive and the collaboration, I mean, they mention as a success factor for their integration, the collaboration they have with the community, because it was successful. If they have any problem, they could manage to solve it with support with the community, or even paying services of other companies around the community. So that was relevant. So from this point of view, I would like to mention as well that a very important, as he also mentioned, was the business model that they have. The implication in the business model they have when they decide to integrate components. So we are in the point that, by means of the RISCOSS project, we want to raise the awareness of the companies that when they integrate open source components, they have several alternatives in order to deal with the risks. So, for instance, if the component that they integrate is a very critical one for the company, so they might even think in participating in the community and to spend resources participating there in order to ensure in some way the sustainability of the community. Another option that they could have, for instance, is to fork the community in order to ensure that the roadmap that the new community will have will be in line with the interests of the company. So there is a lot of diversity in the strategies that they could have. So in the RISCOSS project, we try to make them explicitly, so they are informed about it, and try to measure the risk in each one of the strategies.
Serge, do you agree?
Yes. Actually, I had some time to answer your question. So I will add some argument. I believe an open source provider is confronted to the same issue than a commercial provider. That is, a client will choose a product with similar references, similar operating references. So this is the first point. The second point I forgot.
Let's go to the third.
Yes, the second point is the vendor lock-in. Because even if you choose an open source project, you may be locked in by the business model. So I believe the main argument for an open source product is that the cost of the product is not related to the intensity of the usage. Yes. I mean, there is no license cost progressive with usage. The cost of the software is very particular. Software is not a material, so there is a zero marginal cost. So but the cost of the software is not zero. So the actual cost of the software is between 0 and an enormous margin, such as we can see with Oracle or Microsoft and so on. So we propose with Joram, and I believe this is the key of open source, the cost of the software is related to the cost of the service on the software. So this is the second point that the user will look at. Is the cost of the software related to the usage or fixed related to the service offered on the usage? On the third, I forgot, and I will skip.
It will come back. Yassine, you had an example, interesting example of a voice over IP client which uses open source components to differentiate itself.
Yeah, in fact, for us, one of the key success of open source deployment is usually customer implication. Because most of our customers, especially people with which we are working in order to deploy OpenStack solution or big infrastructure like this one, they know and they understood that they need to invest within their engineering team, and they understood that they need to really take care and being able to more or less take over and handle the component by themselves. So we help a few customers, like a company which is named Leonix Telecom, which is a voice over IP telco located in Paris, or a company like Vinci Concession. We deploy more or less the same type of architectures and infrastructures, and that's those two customers were using VMware previously, but we used to have a very good and deep knowledge on Linux. And at a certain point of time, we have evaluated KVM. We have helped them for this purpose. And they just understood and they discovered that they are more or less being able to have the same type of features, because they usually don't use 100% of the features that vCloud or whatever is providing. So that was more than enough for their usages. And we help them in order to deploy and define a solution which were fully based on Linux, KVM, and open source components, which mean, usually, and that's really the truth with open source from my point of view, and that was what my colleague said. We used to say, it's not coming from us, that with open source and with all these components, the price is what you pay, but the value is what you get. So for us, the fact that customer is really implying a project, have champion within the company which going to be leaders for this project, that's really very, very important for success and for open source implementation.
Guillaume, do you see the proof of concept beginning the natural way to start a project?
Not really on our side. I mean, since we're providing tools to manage open source component within the company, basically, when we start a project with a customer, usually this is because he has some legal consideration about the fact they may are using open source project under, I would say, wrong license or not authorized license. And usually I would say that from this perspective, open source adoption is successful as soon as everyone is aware. The point is, just 2 seconds to go back to what I said previously, the first adoption usually starts in the development team. Okay, and I would say that the adoption is successful when everyone in the company is aware about the fact that the company and the product is integrating open source, including the CEO, and if everyone agree with that, I mean, which means if in the next version of the product there is still open source in the product, I would say that adoption is successful. Because, as I said, sometimes because we start a project and only a few people within the development team knows about open source component inside the product, and if we have some involvement of the legal team or the business team or the CEO, and then sometimes they decide to switch to other solution, of course, adoption is not successful because you have first adoption and then the component is removed. So adoption means that okay, you have a full process involving everyone in the company about the fact that you are using open source and you agree with that and you are able to deliver services.